Thank you for joining us today. We've got a special guest, Jeff McDonald. He's a watchdog and accountability journalist at the San Diego Union-Tribune. He has been an irritant to elected officials across the county since arriving at the UT in 1998. Jeff has helped draw attention to a major theft ring inside the San Diego Food Bank. He's exposed a backroom deal between electric utility executives and regulators that resulted in $1 million rebate to consumers. And today's topic of conversation, he has extensively reported on the very concerning in-custody death rate in San Diego jails. Welcome, Jeff.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
San Diego County jails, you got one of the highest rates of death among California's most populated counties. I've seen in the state audit that we'll discuss a little bit later, there's a recorded 185 dead between 2006 and 2020, 18 dead in 2021, 20 dead in 2022. After you folks released the short story collection, Dying Behind Bars, 19 lawsuits to date have cost the taxpayers at least $75 million. So a very broad question to start. What is going on in San Diego? Why is there such a high rate of death? Just sort of broad strokes to start with.
Brian, that's an excellent question, and one, of course, with no easy answer. I think the only answer I can come up with, and obviously I've given it a lot of thought, is that there's just been a systemic lack of will to correct the problem, a lack of accountability among deputies who violate department policies, lapses in independent oversight of the sheriff's department, lapses by the elected county board of supervisors to impose reforms on a sheriff that's been unwilling to take the steps necessary to prevent these deaths. There's no shortage of failure in this equation. San Diego County, locks up the same kinds of people that every other county does. These are folks that, have medical problems when they get arrested, maybe no health care on the outside, certainly poor health care generally on the inside. But every county confronts budget shortcomings and resource limits that inhibit their ability to provide the best service for incarcerated people. But San Diego seems to do it worse than most other counties, which is hugely troubling.
I think we all believe there's this duty to take care of people when they're in custody, that the state has a responsibility to ensure safety. Most of the people inside jails are actually not yet convicted. They're either awaiting trial or they just couldn't afford bail. There are some violent criminals that are going to be in there, and the inmates should be safe from violent behavior. What we're seeing in San Diego is a sort of different threat of medical negligence. And let's talk about Elisa Serna for a moment. You reported that the lawsuit brought by her family was the highest payout in San Diego County for an in-custody death. For viewers that might not know the story, describe what happened to her while she was in custody. And besides the taxpayers paying that lawsuit amount, was anyone held accountable?
Elisa was arrested for drug charges in November of 2019, so 5+ years ago. She was under the influence when she was taken into custody, and she told the sheriffs at the time of her booking, which is a key piece of information, because when a person admits to opioid use or alcohol dependency or any number of things, certain rules get invoked. And in her case, she was to have been placed on the drug withdrawal protocols that the department has very clearly laid out in its manuals, but she was not. So that affected the level of treatment she received in custody. She wasn't given proper treatment for her alcohol dependency. And she ended up dying after, I think, on her 5th day, 5 days in custody. And she was vomiting and fainting, and she was left alone. And boy, it was just a wrenching case. The last time anyone saw her alive, a deputy and a nurse watched her faint, collapse in her cell, and strike her head and collapse into the floor of her cell. And they left her there. There was some discussion that she may have been faking it, and she was found an hour later deceased in the same position that she was left in. The family did file a lawsuit. Some of the circumstances of the case were just heartbreaking. She was 24 years old. She could not have died from being locked up. The crimes were pretty petty. Settlement to the family, wow, it took 5 years, and they were finally on the cusp of trial when the county agreed to settle, which is typical for any county council office. Those are the folks that defend the the supervisors and the various county departments from litigation. And their job is to minimize the settlement and the cost to the public. But boy, the circumstances of Elisa's death were so tragic, and the negligence was so glaring. The county settled weeks ahead of trial. And as you noted, it was the biggest settlement that the county has paid out. It was a total of $15 million. $14 million of it picked up by the county, and the contract medical provider paid $1 million to the family. So, yeah, it's a tragic case.
There's a video of this, of her in her jail cell. I watched that. Feel horrible. Her parents must have seen that. It's very unpleasant to watch. And I got quite a few calls from San Diego activists that Secure Justice works with. And yet, strangely, if you weren't an activist, I've got family and friends down there, they hadn't heard about this case. It's sort of a theme I've been trying to explore with people I know in San Diego is, where is this sort of just blasé? Just seems like we should see more visible opposition. And we're going to get a little bit more into like the board and other civilian oversight, guardrails that we should have in place. But from just general, regular, everyday San Diegans, are they just completely disinterested? Is it, our beaches and tacos are too amazing, we just don't pay attention to government? Or have people just been, when you look at the predecessor, Sheriff Bill Gore, and we'll talk about him in a bit, he was a legend for all the wrong reasons. Now we got Sheriff Martinez. Have folks just given up and they're like, we're just going to let plaintiffs' attorneys handle this?
Well, these are tough questions. And, we've reflected on this a lot. The reason Kelly Davis and I, my colleague in this scrutiny, the reason we started on this, we did a big project 5 years ago. And the reason we embarked on that investigation is because both of us, for several years, had been writing piecemeal stories about San Diego County jail deaths. And, it's impossible not to notice the commonalities from case after case after case. And she called me one day and congratulated me on a story I'd done, I guess in that day's paper, I don't recall, but she told me what a nice job I'd done because I put in a bunch of context into the story and made some points at the bottom half of the story that this latest death was very reflective of prior deaths, and that the county sheriff's department seems to be committing some of the same violations and same lapses in medical care and other policy violations that have resulted in prior deaths. And so in talking to Kelly that day, we kind of thought about it, and we thought that the one way to drive this point home and kind of force people to pay attention would be to produce a big series and do a deep dive on the issue. And that's what got us started on the series that ran in the fall of 2019. I think it did change public opinion and brought an issue that to date only a small community of plaintiffs' lawyers and family members of deceased incarcerated people knew about. So I think we succeeded in putting it on the public agenda because our series sparked the state audit. The state audit sparked the 2 new bills that got signed into law. They forced the sheriff to resign in midterm. We got a ton of pushback from the sheriff's department. They provoked a bunch of policy changes at the department level. So I think it did sort of put the issue on the front burner of the public agenda. But as you note, there's not a lot of sympathy for people in custody, whether they're convicted or not. So it's a difficult population to make sympathetic. We used to have comments on the bottom of our stories, and every time we wrote about this issue, people would say, oh, if you can't do the crime, don't do the time. Insensitive things like that, ignoring the fact that people convicted of, or not even convicted, arrested for, theft or drunk driving or locked up on a parole violation, were dying in custody, for reasons that people shouldn't die for, which is why the county keeps getting sued and keeps losing lawsuits. So it has been made kind of a public policy priority for the sheriff in recent years, but even so, not enough is being done. And that's not me just saying that. The advocate community agrees with that. A lot of the criminal justice reform people have recommendations. Some of the sheriff's own consultants have put forward recommendations that still have yet to be implemented that they think would help reduce jail deaths. So there's a lot more work to do, as one of the county supervisors said last month.
I've noticed in a few of your reports, and I wanted to touch on this strategy of the county sort of settling day of or on the courthouse steps, so to speak, before trial. It was your colleague, I think Kelly Davis, quoted one of Michael Wilson's attorneys Michael Wilson died after they failed to provide him with heart medication. I believe that was a $5 million lawsuit payout. His wife had even showed up, I think, trying to give him the medicine. They were denying her access. Seemed just very inhumane. But to get back to the county, one of Wilson's attorneys was quoted as saying is that they have this policy of delay, defer, refuse to disclose critical information, to put off everything as long as possible, ostensibly to just drain the resources, both emotional and financial, of the claimants. It's sort of giving off that Luigi Mangione delay, deny, defend type vibes. But county council doesn't decide itself whether to settle or not settle a claim. The county is their client. And so to me, that suggests a failure by the board to really meaningfully address that, because they can direct their attorneys to resolve these cases much earlier. Presumably, it's going to be a whole lot cheaper. Why is that part not happening? Are you asking these types of questions to the board about why they aren't pushing this?
Yeah, no, you've zeroed in on a key problem, is the lack of accountability. And the responsibility for inmates' safety and well-being is not the sheriff's alone. And it's not just a luxury, it's a federal requirement. When you take someone's liberty, you're required to provide them adequate food, adequate clothing, adequate medical treatment. And it simply doesn't happen in all cases. The sheriff certainly bears a lot of responsibility for that. But after repeated events where people die under the same circumstances year after year, you have to look to the Board of Supervisors. I think that for a long time, they just didn't pay close attention. These are elected officials from different districts who have different constituencies and different interests. And protecting the people who are incarcerated in county jail is maybe not their top priority. I have asked them. In recent years, we've started putting into stories that the Board of Supervisors is responsible for approving these settlements, and not just the settlements, but the legal strategies that often result in delays. They're non-lawyers, generally, the electeds. They take their attorney's advice, and I think the mindset of the county council, I wish I could speak to them more directly, even off the record, but they're in a tough spot. Their job is to protect county resources, and they see that as the best way is to fight. And they don't want to pay claims unnecessarily. They want to limit claims as much as they can. They feel like if they settle too soon, that will encourage more people to sue. While there's some reasonableness to that strategy, some of the other things we've heard about withholding evidence and making threats to plaintiffs and intimidating plaintiffs or witnesses, which we've heard repeatedly over the years, not just in any one case or one-offs. I mean, it seems to be systemic. That's troubling. We do try and include in our stories a couple of points every time because they're really important. A, that most of the people who are in jail or who die in jail haven't been convicted. They just, like you said, can't afford bail. The other thing is that the money that these settlements come from directly comes right out of the public treasury. And that means, fewer libraries, fewer road repairs, fewer sheriff's deputies. So there are real problems. I mean, 75 million in recent years. It's more than that now, by the way. But that's real money, and you can operate county parks and county libraries and new streets and all sorts of services that denying ourselves as a community because of these continuing deaths. So I try and point out in stories wherever I can that it's not just the sheriff's responsibility. It's the oversight board. It's the county supervisors. It's the contractors. It's a number of interested parties that haven't stepped up. And the state auditors noted that as well, which I think was pretty critical. They chastised the Citizens Oversight Board. It's called the Citizens Law Enforcement Review Board for not doing enough to complete and perform independent investigations of these deaths. And they chastised the Board of Supervisors for not doing enough to impose reforms. Last month, the Board of Supervisors did approve expanding the review board's authority to include jail medical staff, which is a huge upgrade, a big improvement when it gets implemented. Steps are being taken to do better, which I think is all good because the more eyes on this, the more pressure hopefully translates to fewer deaths down the road. And we've had 2 just in the last month. So these are continuing to happen since you and I first traded emails.
You just reminded me all the bills that Governor Newsom has vetoed over the years. Assemblymember Weber, I think it was AB 2343. It's one of the bills that would have amended an existing state board to include mental health professionals, the governor's veto message was tone deaf. We don't need to add more people to the board, completely just glossing over the fact that there were no mental health specialists on that board. And this state audit had revealed quite a lot of harm in that area. To me, that's another point of failure where your elected representatives did try to do something to improve the situation and lost out to a higher power in the governor's office. It's not the only issue. I'm even surprised by your courts. Something you mentioned earlier triggered my memory where you're talking about in the Cerna's case, how she had informed the jail staff of her condition. Matthew Settles, he was schizophrenic. He was placed into custody. He was conserved by the court. The whole premise of conservatorship is you can't take care of yourself. And so they placed him into jail to get that care, and they failed. They didn't take care of him at all, and he died. It's almost like I am answering my question about maybe why San Diego folks are just letting plaintiffs' attorneys handle it, because the governor failed you, the court failed you, the board is failing you, CLRB is failing you. That's got to be pretty disheartening to folks that do care about civil rights and the value of human life.
My hat's off to the advocate community that has been pressing these issues because they don't get paid to do their work. They do it out of passion and a sense of outrage, which I think is terrific. It's just a great example of democracy in action, and I'm incredibly impressed with their tenacity and their willingness to keep showing up at the meetings and pressing the public officials, which is all we can do as citizens, right? I mean, my job is to draw attention to it, but I need activists and others, lawmakers, policymakers, the plaintiffs' lawyers, the whole gamut of stakeholders to move the ball down the field. I hope it's getting the attention it deserves. I know that, that bill you mentioned didn't pass, but the governor did sign it last year. And there are now expanded seats on the state PSCC to have a mental health professional. There's also a person in charge of in-custody jail deaths, so that now when someone dies in custody, as we've had, 2 in the last month down here in San Diego, they're going to be investigated independently by the state and completed within 90 days. We'll see how transparent it is, how it works, whether it does any real good. But to me, the idea that people are taking some steps, I think is a win and progress. It doesn't mean we're there yet. Ideally, no one would die in jail. It's not supposed to be a death sentence when you steal or drink and drive or whatever it is that you do to get locked up. And in San Diego, the Michael Wilson case you mentioned, in that case, he was being sent back to jail for a parole violation. The judge specifically directed the jail staff, the sheriff, to make sure he got his medication, because his lawyers said, hey, judge, my guy's really vulnerable. If he doesn't get medicated, he could die. And the judge said, okay. And he said to the prosecutor, who was fighting to have him reincarcerated, you have to make sure this guy gets his medicine. He has a court-ordered medication, and it still didn't get delivered, and he died. And that's part of why the county paid $5 million to make that case go away. It's shocking that it keeps happening. The jail, they have their own medication protocols, right? When they don't have the exact medication that somebody needs, they're supposed to match it as closely as possible. You'd like to think that would happen routinely. It doesn't always happen. 2 years after Elisa Cerna died, 3 years, excuse me, she died in 19. Another woman died in the same jail, same after telling the county, the deputies, that she was drug withdrawal protocols and was addicted to opioids and should have been placed into the treatment protocols. She wasn't, and she died, and that was 2022. So what we've got is a case 2+ years later, the same negligence, the exact same finding happens. And now that family is suing the county, and they'll probably have to pay several $1 million to the family of that woman. It's hard to see progress writ large, but we're seeing some steps toward progress. And I think that has to be gratifying to some extent. But the fact that we had another year of double-digit deaths inside San Diego County jails, which has been the case for more years than I can count off the top of my head. I think it's been more than 20 years since they've had fewer than 10, but it's just a big number that keeps happening. And I'm going to keep writing about it as long as they let me.
Yeah. You guys give the information that we activists can then go push on the electeds and the policymakers for. We absolutely need you to keep reporting. Keith Bach was another one. I was reading about a diabetic failure to provide insulin. How do you not have insulin? That's a common, widely available drug. I've seen this in my work. The minute you're inside a jail, the average American just doesn't think you're human anymore. You're subhuman. Well, these are not serial killers, and these are people that definitely should not have suffered harm while they were incarcerated. You brought up the court order, specifically directing that medical care be provided to Mr. Wilson. I didn't see anyone get sanctioned for violating the court order. Is that accurate? I didn't see a single disciplinary action.
This is complicated stuff. There's a lot of moving parts to law enforcement, incarceration. A lot of different interests need to be served. We never know about discipline, almost never, when it comes to deputies, peace officers. They have a ton of rights that have been negotiated by their unions, by the trade groups that represent California peace officers. They get all sorts of confidentiality rules. They get appeal processes. So when you're a deputy and you're accused of misconduct, maybe you're placed on leave, you're usually paid while an investigation goes on. Once in a while, it becomes public when you show up at, say, the Civil Service Commission agenda, where there's a deputy who's been either disciplined or terminated, and they're challenging that. Those are all confidential. You don't get to know who the deputy is. If you sit through the hearing, you can hear what the allegation is and whatnot. But how many people go to the Civil Service Commission meetings? Right. I've been to several over the years, more than several, but I don't go routinely. And unless you're there in person and you have a visual on who the guy shows up, you don't get to know unless they lose and then they take their discipline to Superior Court. Then their identities become known. But there's all these levels of discipline that can be meted out privately that we never hear about. So someone like me, I can't say that the deputy who denied Michael Wilson his heart medication, or the deputies that failed Mr. Bach and his diabetes medicine, his insulin, perhaps they were disciplined. We don't know. And, is that the sheriff's fault? Not really, because, her hands are tied. She needs to maintain the support of her troops. Right. And that's important for morale. But she's also hamstrung by the rules of collective bargaining agreements that mandate all this stuff be confidential. So that's an issue maybe with your state lawmaker. There's a lot of liability that everybody's facing in these cases. Nobody wants to get caught with the old maid. Nobody wants to be held to public account. And it's easy to keep that stuff hidden. So we don't get to know about the discipline. I'd like to think that they've been reassigned, certainly at least retrained, or in some cases fired, and they haven't opposed their termination, so they're just gone and we don't know about it. But again, almost impossible for us, the public or reporters, to keep track of specific disciplinary proceedings against individuals. So,
yeah, two of my biggest obstacles. One, as a privacy activist, I'm always stunned that California has one of the strong police officer Bill of Rights, which is one of the laws you're talking about, shielding these disciplinary record matters from being published. When it comes to the privacy for the police, they're very much pro-privacy, just not for the rest of us. But my real nemesis, and I've been chasing sheriffs around for years, even before we formed Secure Justice, is Government Code 25303, which is one of the more confusing statutes. It's about 2 sentences long. Says that a county board of supervisors shall supervise the official conduct of sheriffs and district attorneys. And then the very next sentence says, shall not obstruct or interfere with the prosecutorial investigative duties of those respective offices. And there's not a lot of case laws. What does that mean? Mm-hmm. I want to make clear, as someone in Alameda County, I certainly empathize with you folks. We had our version of Gore, Greg Ahern, who was replaced also by a younger female sheriff. She was in charge of the jails, and our jail, Santa Rita, also has a significant death rate. We're actually under federal supervision right now, brought about as a result of plaintiffs' lawsuits. Our county board has also failed to ever hold the sheriff accountable. And I want to explore this a little bit as we maybe segue into sort of more localized civilian oversight. Dodging subpoenas. Gore had a big habit of that. I've seen a little bit of that reported. or at least as the board was contemplating giving CLRB subpoena power, or the Sheriff Martinez says, we're not going to, follow that. We had that here in Alameda. Sheriff Villanueva in Los Angeles, his behavior was so bad, the voters finally reacted, which is actually something in Oakland we did as a city. Our police department's been under federal oversight for 22 years. We basically gave up on the federal court ever doing anything because they don't really hold anybody accountable. The electeds are certainly not holding people accountable. So the voters kept giving the police commission more and more authority. They got their own independent counsel, got an inspector general. And I noticed those are a few things Paul Parker tried. Paul Parker was the former executive officer of the Civilian Law Enforcement Review Board, CLRB. Give us some insights there as to what you saw. CLRB was established in the 90s. That's before Gore even shows up. San Diego at some point said, hey, we should have this body to look at our jails. I know as an activist that I've gotten, wins on paper because we forced it on the electeds, but they never truly supported it. And I've seen at your city, at your county levels of government, clear administrative interference. Do you feel CLRB has ever been fully supported by the board? Has it ever been fully resourced? Because that's another way you start the baby is you just don't fund it.
Right. It's interesting. It's in San Diego County at the time, I'm told, the Board of Supervisors was at odds with the elected sheriff in the late 80s and early 90s and put forward the citizens initiative that resulted in the CLRB as a direct response to their dissatisfaction with the then sheriff. And they did fund it. And they did award it subpoena power. CLRB eventually negotiated away its subpoena authority. It agreed in subsequent collective bargaining agreements with the county agreed not to execute subpoenas and exercise that authority. So they have it on paper, but they don't use it. So that's the case with CLRB. Once that sheriff was defeated, CLRB was, I don't want to say starved, but it was minimalized because the supervisors at that time, this is a generation ago, they'd won that grudge match against the sheriff at the time. They brought in a different sheriff who was much more popular and won a bunch of elections in a row. Throughout the 90s, CLRB became less and less, I don't want to say effective, but didn't matter as much. Their relevance was kind of minimalized and they were sort of just kind of sidelined. And that was the case through the early 2000s into the 2010s. Kelly, to her credit, started going to CLRB meetings a decade plus ago. I started writing about it when I saw her stories in the San Diego City Beat, was a publication she worked for at the time. And so we started paying more attention to the review board maybe 10, 12 years ago. Paul Parker came in as a change agent in the mid-2010s. And really started doing some effective oversight, started breathing new life into it, trying to lobby for a bigger budget, more staff, more thorough investigations. Met some success, but he got another offer and left San Diego County in 2019, I believe. Came back in 2020, right after COVID. So he had 2 terms with the San Diego County Review Board. And he came back when a Democratic majority was elected to the Board of Supervisors, which was a huge shift in San Diego County governance. So he had what he considered a mandate to do more robust civilian oversight of the sheriff's department. It went well. He made some notable wins, got a bigger budget. The budget's now probably 4 times what it was 10 years ago. The staff is double, and he's pushing for more. And he's got the support, actually, we just had some internal political stuff in the county. So one of the supervisors resigned. So we're going to be at a 2-2 standstill for some months. But he quit last year out of just severe frustration because even while he was able to notch some wins and file reports that found blame with the sheriff and or others, just wasn't seeing enough support from the Board of Supervisors and others. And felt like he told me he was banging his head against the wall and they beat him down. And he left last spring, much to his regret, but he just couldn't do it anymore. The county hired a new guy, former FBI, seems very diligent. He's been on the job for 6 months, seems very committed. He's behind this effort to expand CLRB authority to the jail medical staff. That was one of Paul's big initiatives that he was unable to meet. Getting the supervisors to agree just last month to expand the CLRB oversight to jail medical staff was a big step for the board and for CLRB. We'll see where it goes and how effective that is. But these are baby steps, and, it's all you can do, one thing at a time.
Let's just expand a little bit on two of the things that you said that really caught my attention. I've definitely got a thorn in my side when I helped the city establish the surveillance technology ordinance and the privacy advisory board. And immediately once he entered office, current mayor Todd Gloria did everything he could to obstruct that. What I've seen in reading about Paul Parker and your reporting, it looks like he was fighting the CLRB, the board itself also, like on the inspector general. And I wasn't aware they negotiated away their subpoena power. Why? And is this just evidence of salting the board? That's another way you kill civilian oversight, is just put puppets on there, put very pro-police, they'll always tell the truth, they'll never do anything wrong.
Only in recent years has the board been more steadfast in selecting people that are, I don't want to say anti-law enforcement, but law enforcement skeptics, which is what an oversight board needs to be, like right. A journalist or an activist. Certainly you hear out the sheriff's department or the probation department, whoever, when you're doing oversight, but you also have to exercise independence. The CLRB board for years was staffed by friends of law enforcement. I don't think that was accidental at all. So when Paul came in, that was a big problem he confronted. The board has turned over quite a bit in the last 7-8 years, which is, I think, a benefit to the board itself, to the community, to everybody, maybe the sheriff's office. Listen, if you're going to have civilian oversight, you need to have independent people serving on that body, or why bother? You're just going through motions. He encountered a lot of pushback from his own board members, which I think was the source of some frustration as well. I think a lot of that had been tackled by the end of his second tenure with San Diego County. So I don't think that's an issue today as it was 5 years ago and longer. Hopefully that doesn't come back. But electeds, they put in committees or blue ribbon panels or whomever to make it look like they're doing something to address a problem. But, like I said, our job as journalists is to keep drawing attention to these matters. I try and remind people in my stories that they should care about this, because you could be arrested tomorrow. And you could be denied bail, and you could be denied medication. Also, the money that is going to these lawsuits comes right out of the public treasury, which means we don't get longer library hours, or we don't get newer roads or sewers or cleaner water or whatever service it is that could be funding instead of the litigation and the settlements.
At the same point in their career, Gore and Martinez. Is Martinez an improvement upon what we saw from former Sheriff Gore?
Absolutely.
On her own, or has it been just forced on her because there's just been more effective advocacy?
Well, I would say yes and yes. Listen, she's Gore's handpicked successor, so we can't forget that. She was a Republican for years and years and years and switched parties to run for sheriff after she was chosen to be undersheriff when Gore knew or expected he would be leaving in midterm. So she was kind of set up as his successor. To her credit, she has been a lot more, I don't want to say welcoming, that would be overstating it, but a lot more receptive, and at least is addressing some of the issues we've been writing about. She's put forward a number of policy changes. She's requested money for better facilities inside the jails. She's reached settlements with some plaintiffs over ADA issues inside jails. In addition to simply acknowledging it was a problem, when Kelly Davis and I did our first series, the sheriff wouldn't talk to us. And we spent months saying, look, this isn't just a story. We're doing a deep dive. And we ended up meeting with a handful of his senior advisors, very strange meeting. They ended up just reading us their talking points and giving us statements, which I didn't think served the department well, and told them as much. I said, look, these are serious questions and you're not giving us serious responses. The day the first story ran, Gore went on TV and denied our reporting, denied our findings, said we were grossly mistaken, and it was his own data. So it was kind of a preposterous position. The new sheriff has never done that, and I give her a lot of credit for acknowledging the problem. They apologize to families now. They appoint liaisons between the families and the department. They haven't been very effective to date. So many of the families say they don't call me back, or when they do call back, they won't tell me anything, and I can't get answers to, I don't know what killed my son or my daughter or my husband. And it's a real shame because they have to think about it liability-wise. So they can apologize and say we regret what happened, but they can't assume liability because that costs money down the road. And so there's a lot of competing interests that are colliding when someone dies in custody.
Yeah. Let's wrap this up with a positive thing. Turnup family, saving lives in custody, California. We sort of have our analog up here. Actually, a couple families. Oscar Grant, the individual young man that was murdered by BART police. His uncle Bobby and Aunt B go around. They've now set up a foundation to help families that have also suffered loss of life or been greatly harmed by law enforcement. The Quinto family is another one that have also set up a foundation to help other families. They've pressed successfully for lawsuits. They had a pretty significant settlement recently. They've also got some state law changes to their name. I know it's brand new, but you reported quite a bit on the Saving Lives Foundation. What are the Cernas going to do with this?
Well, we'll see. I can't tell you, Brian, how proud I am of that family. I met them the day they came down to San Diego to view Elisa's body. They invited me there because they wanted her story told. And they called me out of the blue and said, we're on our way. And this was 5 years ago. So that case has been very special to me for a long time. Paloma Cerna is just an amazing woman. She and her husband have responded more incredibly than you can imagine to the kind of tragedy that they were confronted. Unbelievable grief. And the way they were treated by the sheriff's office, the county council, even the board of supervisors, they never strayed from their mission, which was to promote reforms. And they did get $15 million. And they're using that money to fund this nonprofit effort, which is advocating on behalf of so many other families that maybe weren't as fortunate, don't have the kind of case elements that would lead to a multi-million-dollar settlement, but they're using their voice to draw attention to some of these same continuing failures by the sheriff's department, which I think is just a terrific testament to them and to their daughter's memory. It's remarkable. None of us knows how we would respond to this sort of grief. The way Paloma and Michael have responded is just, it's a gift to the community. And I wrote about it because I want them to succeed as a member of the community, because it's important to have voices of experience that can help push policymaking in the right direction. And they've done that very effectively at the state level, at the local level. They're going to other counties now. I hate to say there's a template for activism, but they know what their impediments have been. They know how to try and get around them. They know how to use the media to their advantage, which are all good things. That's what a healthy democracy does. Whether you agree with their position or not, anytime you can foment a debate on a matter of public policy that's important, that's as important as these, I think we're all better served for that sort of discourse. And I just give them incredible props for stepping up, putting their money where their mouth is. And I think as much as it hurts as a taxpayer to see $15 million go to the family of a deceased, incarcerated person who died wrongly in jail, to see some of that money put to good use it's just a huge testament to their character. And I'm so proud of them.
I'm really hopeful this leads somewhere. I've seen this model, this template work in the Bay Area, not only local change, but actually state laws. I know just from my own firsthand conversations, there's other states looking at some of the state laws California enacted because the Quinto family pushed for it. You and I play different roles. We got advocates and the journalists that are highlighting, but the Cerna family is the why. We can talk about how to fix this thing, or I'm the policy guy, I can go write a policy, but without the why, it just doesn't land right. So I'm really rooting for them. I'm really glad because I had not seen that reported in any other article that I was researching. I'm really glad you highlighted that and lifted them up.
Yeah. She told me as much when they announced the settlement last summer. She told me she was going to do that. I was happy to do that story, Brian. I think they've been a terrific voice for others who don't have the skill to address the media, to get your talking points together, to find the right way to frame your point of view. I mean, these are all advocacy strategies that you know well, and I recognize them and see their value. But for regular people to take on that mantle under difficult circumstances like the death of a loved one, it's remarkable. I couldn't be more pleased for them I think I put this in the headline of the story, is they're wrestling triumph out of tragedy, which is basically the best outcome you can imagine in a terrible circumstance.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate your time, Jeff. To our audience viewers, I encourage you to subscribe to the San Diego Union-Tribune to keep catching up with Jeff's important writing, his colleague Kelly Davis as well. We're very grateful for your time and this opportunity to speak with you about these matters. I appreciate it.
Thank you, and thank you for the work you do.